Hello, everyone. I welcome you to this last session of our webinar series on hate speech and whiteness. We've had a great week already with 4 sessions on these topics. And today we have the last and the final one. And I do look forward to this session. We have organized these series of sessions on hate speech and whiteness in the framework of the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace, the overarching program of the World Council of Churches for this period between the assemblies. And within the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace reference group, as we traveled through different places, different locations, putting our bodies as good pilgrims into different communities, we have learned that racism is one of the key issues, one of the key challenges to justice and peace in every context. There is no society, there is no community where racism is not found as a phenomenon, as an injustice. So it is for the World Council of Churches in its pilgrimage of justice and peace, of course, urgent, timely, and very important that we focus on this phenomenon. So this is why we have organized a theological forum last year in Tokyo, in Japan. And we continue the discussion in this webinar series in the time of this pandemic, where we cannot meet in person, but we can still meet on the internet. We can still meet in a Zoom meeting. So here we have in this Zoom meeting, several speakers, participants, either members of the Theological Study Group on the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace, or they have been participants in the Theological Forum last year in Tokyo, in Japan. So warm welcome to you also, speakers, participants in this room. We have the possibility, of course, to use the chat room here in the Zoom meeting. But all of you who are listening, watching this live stream, then you are mostly invited to participate as well. Use the chat room. There is a possibility to comment. We welcome questions, and I will do my best to bring in these questions into the discussion if that is possible at some time. So it is great to be here again, and I also welcome you on behalf of our Deputy General Secretary, Professor Isabel Firi, who will join us a bit later today, and this is why I am opening this session. As it is common in our circles in the fellowship, in this ecumenical fellowship, let us start this meeting with a moment of prayer. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Creating Father, Mother, reconciling Son, empowering Spirit, today we turn to you to seek guidance from your word for our use of words. We witness how hate speech paves the way for violent attacks all around the globe, in Germany, in France, in South Africa, and so many other places. Teach us, O God, anew, the power of words, so that we may become ever more careful in choosing our words, that we may become ever more sensitive in recognizing the effects of our words, that we may become ever more gentle in searching for words of comfort, and that we may become ever more courageous in speaking truth to power. Bless this meeting, O God, as we seek your word in the toxic web of hate speech to overcome the injustice of racism. This we pray in the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hate speech today we want to focus on hate speech based on caste and class discrimination and religion. And we have first speaker. I would like to introduce to you Brother Guido Dotti. Guido Dotti is a member of the Ecumenical Monastery of Bose in Italy, a chair of the Diocesan Commission for Ecumenism and Interreligious Dialogue in Biella in Italy. And Guido is the secretary of the Piemonte Valle d'Aosta Regional Commission for Ecumenism and Interreligious Dialogue. Guido is also the Roman Catholic member of our theological study group on the pilgrimage of justice and peace. So Brother Guido has been traveling with us through the past years, and it is a great pleasure, Guido, to have you with us. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation to present the paper today. Over to you.
Thank you, Fernando. And thank you to all you brothers and sisters in Christ and friends in humanity. And thank you for this opportunity to share with you my thoughts and my worries about hate speech. And let me start with a short poem by Emily Dickinson. A word is dead when it is said, some say. I say it just begins to live that day. Well, I had always grasped in these wonderful words a profoundly positive meaning, the power of a spoken word, its ability to give life, to start fruitful paths, to open new horizons. But the spread of hate speech in our contemporary society has now led me to grasp at the same time all its potential negative value. Even a word of slander, of backbiting, of defamation, even a word of perjury do not die as soon as they are spoken. But on the contrary, they begin their life, a life that can lead to death, not of the one who has spoken them, but of the recipient. But let us go to a scripture warning. The awareness of the even deadly effectiveness of the word runs all over Old and New Testament. I put as a title of my speech, New Forms of an Ancient Evil. Hate speech is in fact a very ancient evil. And we found the same consciousness in other sacred texts of the great religious traditions and with the cultural heritage of humanity of every place and time. In chapter 28 of the book of Sirach, we find a good summary of this power of the speech and the language. In verse 18 of chapter 28, we read, "The tongue kills more than the sword." But there is a word of Jesus in the gospel according to Matthew that goes beyond the wisdom expressed by the author of Sirach. In the so-called Sermon on the Mount, shortly after the Beatitudes, resounds a warning that I find very strong. "But I say to you," says Jesus, "whoever says to his brother, 'Raka,' shall be in danger of the Sanhedrin, but whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be in danger of Gehenna." So we can ask ourselves, eternal judgment and condemnation for epithets that are customary today, which we hear without scandal, even in the mouths of children. We would be led to think so, and yet the first letter of John helps us to grasp the exact scope of this admonition of Jesus, showing us its most radical consequences. So writes the first letter of John, All who hate a brother or sister are murderers. Hate speech generates hatred and provokes a profound wound in the offended person. The Jewish tradition recognized that the insult causes a redness on the face of the offended person, a sign of an alteration in the blood circulation, and therefore, because blood represents life, constitutes a threat to the life of the insulted person. So we can understand better the harshness of Jesus' words against those who address their brother or sister in such a way as to make him or her blush. But the contemporary phenomenon of hate speech, to which we are tragically becoming accustomed in recent decades, is even more serious than behavior that is harmful to the dignity of a single person. If in fact slander can be traced back to unpleasant gossip, if backbiting, defamation, and perjury target a specific person or a well-defined group and are punishable by criminal prosecution when they exceeded a certain public dimension, hate speech, on the other side, takes on a dimension of physical violence from the very first appearance on the public scene, often in explicit forms. And significantly, even when single people are targeted, they are so because they belong to very specific social groups perceived as other by the verbal hater. In particular, women, people of other ethnic groups, foreigners and migrants, political opponents. Thus, gender injustice and racism find verbal expression in the hate speech relaunched by all the mass media, starting with social networks, a climate of incivility that increasingly ends up triggering violent behavior. On the other hand, even what we could once define as educational agency now seem to be places where every kind of language is accepted and even propagandized as outspoken, free from hypocrisy and falsehoods. So in the school world, in political debates, among communication operators, sometimes even in religious sphere, political correctness has become synonymous with hypocrisy, while systematic insult to a targeted hatred are considered has a free course against the people we hate. We see once again the close link between the denial of the truth and the traumas it can cause in people publicly offended just because they belong to a minority, a gender, an ethnic or a social group different from those of social haters. Nor can it be overlooked how hate speech and violence are increasingly turning into physical violence, triggering an uncontrollable spiral. What is more difficult to emerge is the possible response to this phenomenon of daily relationship degradation. The very nature of hate speech makes it difficult to contrast it with the ordinary instruments of languages. So how to fight hate and hate speech? I would like to sketch out a path against hate speech that we can compare to a pandemic. And in this sense, the recent worldwide spread of the coronavirus and this characteristic of threat constantly lurking in the world, starting from interpersonal relationship, can provide us with some good practices. I am thinking, first of all, of a more appropriate metaphor to narrate the daily contrast to hate speech. Whenever we are faced with an event, a reality, or a situation that we consider a threat to our lives and to those we care about, it is natural to use the metaphor of war. We are at war against an enemy. This was also the case in the prevailing narrative of the fight against the coronavirus and its deadly consequence for a large number of people around the world. But hatred and its violence cannot be defeated with their own weapons. Historical experiences of non-violent struggle, a tool radically different from war, show that the most effective antidote to even mortal wounds caused by hatred is not hate, but love, declined in the most everyday and secular form the world knows, that is care. Care for people, for the environment, for interpersonal relationships, for the common good. As I wrote in a reflection in the first weeks of the spread of the pandemic in Italy, we can I said that both war and care have need of some attributes, such as strength, that is so different from violence, of course, perspicacity, courage, resoluteness, also tenaciousness. These are resources of which in reality, and unlike war professionals, verbal haters do not seem to be particularly gifted, weak as they are with the strong and fearful in hiding behind the anonymity of social media, stubborn rather than tenacious, obsessive rather than perceptive. But what nourishes in daily life the duration and progress of war or care are radically different foods. War needs enemies, borders and trenches, arms and ammunition, spies, deception and lies, ruthlessness and money, all elements which, as everyday experience teaches us, are also indispensable to fuel hate speech. Either then, to counter these deadly words, it is absolutely necessary to use different ethical tools, the tools of care that are closeness, solidarity, compassion, humility, dignity, delicacy, tact, listening, authenticity, patience, perseverance. And the first area for this care as an antidote to hate speech is precisely the language area. What will you do first, Confucius was asked, assuming Prince Wei entrusted you with the government? And Confucius replied, it is absolutely necessary to give words back their true meaning. Bring words back to the reality they mean. Bring to light the truth they contain. Call things and people by name with their proper names. Don't give in to slogan, cliché, stereotypes that imprison people and events in caricature cages. This care for language, words, and their value is the first step in caring for people who have been hurt by hate speech. It allows us to look at these victims as men and women in the flesh, inhabited by feelings, shaped by their personal stories, affection, faces, and stories that have marked them from better or worse. Only rarely do we know them personally. Almost never are we allowed to approach them physically. But this does not prevent us from seeking and finding ways to express our closeness to them, our suffering with them. Understanding suffering is the interpretative key that opens up to the creativity of caring for individuals. If we understand that a human being suffers, if we listen to the silent cry that rises from his pain or her pain, if we try to detect the reasons for his or her suffering, then our being close to them will find the most suitable ways and times, the most reliable allies to solve that suffering. So I will finish with the role of Christians in this contrast, non-violent and language contrast to hate speech. Is a responsibility of each person of any or no religion, faith, but in fact is in a particular way a responsibility for Christians. It is a very demanding daily work caring for the weakness of our most wounded Christians, or most wounded persons. And in this task, Christians have the gospel as their ultimate guide and reference, and in the gospel, Jesus' words, gestures, and behavior. By listening to how Jesus himself came into contact with people on the margins of the religious and social world of his time, we, his disciple of the 21st century, can discern on the one hand who is most in need of our care, and on the other hand, what balms can soothe their wounds. The gospel are a mine of despised humanity. Things about poor shepherds stigmatized because they are unable to respect the rules of worship, or young women brutally deprived of their newborns, lepers driven out of towns and villages, publicans pointed out as execrable collaborators of the occupying power, widows denied their rights, prostitutes and adulterers who are also to blame for those who exploit their bodies with impunity, foreign women ignoring their needs, blind, crippled, and lame rejected as superfluous excrescences, children victims of scandals, poor people from whom even their cloaks are taken away. All this person we can meet in the gospel. A humanity that suffer and that must suffer not only the mockery of the rich and powerful, but also the mockery of those who feel socially promoted by insulted people weaker than themselves. A humanity that we, disciples of Jesus, have in front of our eyes every day, on the sole condition of not looking elsewhere, of not closing our ears to the voice of those who have no voice. A humanity to which Jesus himself asks us to be close, making sure that the first beneficiaries of this human solidarity will be ourselves. Taking care of the victims of hatred, both verbal and physical, we will discover that it is precisely the wounded humanity of those people that will heal our wounds, that will enrich our poverty, that will transform our heart of stone into a heart of flesh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Guido Dotti from Italy, for your words, your reflections on the phenomenon of hate speech. We have, as we have done previously, also invited beforehand one of us to respond, to prepare a response for you. And this will be now Anthony Reddy. Let me introduce Anthony Reddy to you. Professor Reddy is director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture at Regent's Park College in Oxford. and he's an extraordinary professor of theological ethics at the University of South Africa. As a participative educator and liberation theologian, he specializes in undertaking action research and participative observational work with predominantly poorer Black communities in the United Kingdom. And Anthony has helped us already in a lot of ways to understand racism with his theological reflections. We have a pre-recorded presentation or response from Anthony Reddy here, because he at this moment is sitting at a location where the internet connection was not safe enough. So he cannot be with us here live, but this is what he has sent. Anthony Reddy.
Yeah, hello, my name is Anthony Reddy. I'm the director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture, part of Regent's Park College, that in turn is part of Oxford University. Also an extraordinary professor with the University of South Africa. It's my pleasure to say a few words, really, in addition to the written response I've made to the paper given by Guido Dotti about hate speech. I think the fundamental thing I really want to affirm is that in the paper, I love the way in which the author reminds us that words matter. Words are not empty, they're not without significance. Words indeed are the major ways in which we convey meaning and knowledge and perceptions of reality and truth. And therefore, when they're used in a negative and a destructive fashion, it's not simply that is a negative thing. It has major impacts upon the very being of those who are being introduced on the receiving end of how words are used. Therefore, hate words are a major theological, they're a major political, they're a major social issue that we need to, I think, vociferously challenge. Especially their normalization, that we have a context now whereby mainstream politicians are using the kind of rhetoric of hate that once used to be the preserve of those who we might describe as being extremists. Those on the extreme right, on the extreme left, those who are seen to be beyond the orbit of normal, polite discourse on politics, were the ones who were seemingly the only people who engaged in hate words, hate speech. Now it's been normalized. Been so normalized that actually, if we're not careful, we end up being seduced into not seeing the real toxic nature of such discourse. Such discourse that ultimately, as Dotti shows, has this continuum that starts with the othering of particular groups, particular people who are stigmatized and are seen as problems to the body politic. They're usually minorities, usually migrants. We see them on the be labelled in pejorative terms, and you then go from that part of the continuum over to physical violence and death. And one inevitably becomes the harbinger of the other. Therefore, the old lie that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me, is not a lie, it's a damnable lie. Because actually words and speech does harm. It creates a climate in which others are, well, those who are othered are seen as a problem, they're seen as less than human, they're seen as of less significance than those who are part of the mainstream, those who are deemed to be normal or respectable, and then before you know it, as night follows day and day follows night, you end up with violence and ultimately genocide. Therefore, we have to stand vigilant against the normalization of hate speech. We have to stand against the vigilance, and we have to be vigilant, in order not to accept the seemingly acceptability of using hate speech in order to describe other human beings. I certainly agree with Dotti that actually the fundamental thing we have to do is to create relationships and to create ways of engaging with each other that are based upon mutuality and a proximity. It's much harder to use hate speech when you are in the presence of the people you are trying to objectify and trying to create as lesser. It's not a perfect panacea, but it's easier to do it so long as the other remains out of our purview, so long as they are seen as distant from us. It's not for nothing that the central aspect of the gospel is the incarnation, and God moves from far away into being intimate with us, takes on our very form. Jesus becomes human, and the significance of that is that then creates an enduring bond between God and humans that can never be broken. And we are asked to replicate that in the bonds of love that we create with each other, that will enable us to dispel and to eradicate, hopefully, hate speech. Thank you very much for listening to me. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anthony. It would be, of course, be great to have Anthony now with us to start the discussion here, but he has given us a lot. So Guido, you want to react to this response, or shall we open the floor for everyone?
Perhaps you can open the floor. So because there was a very complementary and deep consensus between my speech and Anthony words, of course. Right. So we can go on discussing with everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Well, feel free, Guido, to always come in here because you are the main presenter. Peter, you want to comment a bit?
Thank you, Guido, for your presentation. I'm not sure whether my sound is working very well, so I may not be making sense even. Okay. So I wanted to raise a couple of things. Firstly, maybe when we as white people are talking about hate speech, we also need to address hate silence. And that's part of this whole kind of realm at the moment of the way that actually you don't need to say anything at all to allow hate speech to triumph, and also the perceived silence of white people in the context of racism only empowers that. So I think there's something there for us to consider. In our presentations, in our discussions this week, we've touched from time to time on owning our speech as hate speech. And that as a missionary organization we've tried to show, for example, but how God talk is actually a form of hate speech. So I'm curious to hear from you a bit more maybe about how you would bring that confession, reflection into our thinking too. Can you see that in our God talk is a form of hate speech? Can be a form of hate speech or hate silence even. So to share those things.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Peter. Guido, you want to respond to that?
Yes, I think it's very important to underline also the aspect of the hate silence, because it's both sides, the speech and the silence, that create a climate of hate. And we are aware that we are already in a pandemic climate of hate. But on the other side, if we choose to contrast hate speech with care speech, we can find also the power of the silent caring of people. I mean, it's normal that how many times in our own experience we are really taking care for people by staying silent side to side with them. So there is the silence of the people that do not join the cry against injustice, and this is a kind of hate silence. So the silence of the mediocrity of our good life, everyday life. But there is also the silence of the people that just stay hand by hand with other people, saying nothing, but just expressing their love, their care for people, being with them, and against the hate that wound them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Guido. My question is, I'm still wrestling a bit with this phenomenon of hate speech, what we see in the unsocial media. I sometimes say unsocial media because of the effects. Is what we see, the polarization, the growing polarization of within all the societies, is that a result of hate speech, or is it more, should we more understand it in this way, that hate speech is simply the outer expression of an ongoing polarization in the societies all over the world? So it is just an illustration of another development of other root causes. How would you see that, Guido?
Well, I find it a little bit strange that we heard about great polarization nowadays, and at the same time, you heard that in the political and social field, there is no more left and right wing. So we are polarized where? Up and down, probably. I think that now the polarization, if it's not left and right wing, is up and down side. And in this sense, the tension, the hate speech works very well because it's a good way to make the 1% up able to let a great part of the 99% with them through the hate speech. So there is the possibility to move the hate speech against the last people, the poorest, because in this sense, the people that are just above the last one feel themselves like nearer to the first than to the last. And the hate speech is wonderful to obtain this kind of result. And for this reason, I think it's important to stay with people and talk with them and be silent among them and support them taking care of their wounds.
And is I mean, Anthony is proposing to, in our theological reflection, is proposing to reflect on the incarnation. That's a bit short there, his explanation. Do you find that helpful? Can you build that into your own reflections, where you refer to the Sermon on the Mount, but also some other theological thoughts? Is the incarnation, in which way is that helpful for dealing with hate speech?
Well, I think it's helpful in this if we take an aspect of incarnation. That means that we have a real human model in the life of in Jesus' lives for us. We have not to, like says the Deuteronomy, the will of God is not outside the sea, is not above the clouds, but is nearby you. And the incarnation and the presence of Jesus as a fully human being is for us a support that shows us that it is possible to have a fully human life taking care of people. We don't need divine powers to be like our brothers and sisters in humanity. We have just to follow Jesus Christ in his human life, and we will follow him, as the scriptures say us, also in death and resurrection.
Thank you. Professor Sione Havea, biblical scholar, maybe you can help us here.
I'm not sure help. Thank you, Guido. Black and brown people also use language to express their frustration and their hate to white people and to other Black people and so forth. But is it because of this top and bottom that you have referred to? Is that why it's not labeled as hate speech, but more as kind of resistance? Or, I mean, where is a power dynamic and how that comes into this speech act, the use of language to express animosity? Is there something there? I'm just, thank you.
Well, I think that hate and war are the simplest ways to face difficult situation. So it's not a question of being in the top or in the bottom, or being white, black, or brown. Our first reaction of a wound towards a wound is to answer with the same money. So we, since the beginning of humanity, we answer to violence with another violence. It is normal that we answer, or we are used to answer to hate speech with another hate speech, no matter of the color of our skin, I think. I think the one thing is our first reaction, our normal reaction, and another side is planning in a very programmatic way the spreading of hate speech, such as the spreading of war, the spreading of weapons. Is the same kind of, it's normal that we try to find a weapon to fight against the enemy, but it's planned and structured the fact that I have a weapon on my side. I think that in this sense, we had to contrast with a different kind of tools, a totally different kind of tools that concern both top and bottom, or people that because they are not at the very bottom, they think they are in the top. That is normally our position. Thank you, John.
Yes, I'm not sure that I would go all the way with you, Guido, in you're not reducing that, but to see this this bottom and high up distinction. What my fear is actually that hate speech has found its way into everyday life by the use of media, or the misuse of the new media that we have at hand to simply make short statements without looking the other person into the eye, and it is so easy to dehumanize the other. Now, Anthony is reminding us that this dehumanization, and you are referring to the same phenomenon, this dehumanization is always the beginning of actual violence. I mean, we saw that just in France these days. In Europe, we are really shocked again by an eruption of a killing of a school teacher. But it is there's always this connection with the hate speech. There's always a young extremist has been empowered by others, not only bystanders, by supporters who use hate speech, who do this othering. We have seen that 2 weeks ago in my city here in Hamburg in Germany, that a young Jew, a Jewish student who was going to the synagogue to pray was beaten up on the street out of nothing, just because he's walking on the street wearing a kippah, visibly another. And that happens in Germany, where we thought, and we were so proud of our way of, dealing with the past, being self-critical, doing everything we could in order to overcome anti-Judaism and so on. With this hate speech, it leads to violent action, and in the end to genocide, as we have heard. Now, I wonder, going back to this incarnation story again, I wonder if the incarnation movement of God is the counter narrative to that. The word becomes flesh. It's the same phenomenon. So first there are words and then it becomes action. But with this incarnation of God's love into humanity, shows that, yes, if we refer to another word, the word, we would say in the Christian faith language, there's also these actions of care that you are pondering at. They are growing, and this is where the hope is. So somehow this incarnation story for me now sounds like a huge counter narrative, and then that we are not just left with hate speech. Yeah, so we can analyze it. So what, everybody, it's easy to understand. But what we want is we're seeking for resources. How do we counter that? Right. Thanks a lot, Guido. Elizabeth, I see you doubting if you should speak. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Fernando. Guido, thank you very much for your excellent paper. It brings a lot of healing. I wish that your presentation can be circulated widely, not just in print form, but in a speech form, and it can bring healing. And I go very much with Fernando to support incarnation, because that brings in the aspect of solidarity. Here in London, I associate it with the announcements that come in the train station, the main London Victoria, every time, mind the gap. And I say, and they say, mind the gap between the train and the platform. And I say incarnation, is bridging the gap between God and humanity, and bridging the gap, between this hate speech and hate actions and love. Everything can come into action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Friends, let's move on. We have the luxury of having another presenter here, another speaker. I would like to introduce to you the Reverend Philip Vinod Peacock, who is the Executive Secretary for Justice and Witness at the World Communion of Reformed Churches, based in Hanover, in Germany. Philip is an ordained minister in the Church of North India. He works closely with the World Council of Churches on issues of economic and ecological justice. And Philip is a member of the International Planning Group for the Global Ecumenical Theological Institute for the 11th Assembly of the World Council of Churches. So you can see he's very much involved in the Ecumenical Fellowship with different capacities, different hats. Philip, a warm welcome again. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Fernando. And also thank you very much to Isabel for inviting me to speak to you and this wider group today. If you will allow me, I will share my screen for the PowerPoint. I would also like to thank my cousin Rachel for actually making this PowerPoint. I am not an expert at PowerPoint, and she's, so please, this is all hers. I would like to actually speak about hate speech in the context of religious violence and look at it specifically from the Indian perspective. And the paper that I'm about to present is caught between three tensions. The first is the tension between the freedom of speech and hate speech. And I think that is something that we need to bring to the forefront here, particularly in the context of what's been happening in Paris now. Secondly, the tension between justice and unity. And this is something I would like to highlight as well. And thirdly, the tension between justice and election. How do we account for the fact that we speak of a God of justice, but also God who chooses a particular group of people? And I think it's relevant for us to speak about hate speech in the context of these three tensions. I would like to locate my paper very specifically in the context of the riots that took place in New Delhi earlier this year. And I have to warn you that the next two images are probably triggering, a caution over there. This is one image taken from those times, and between the 23rd of February and the 1st of March this year, violence gripped the northeastern sectors of the city of New Delhi. The violence was specifically along religious lines and was targeted against the minority Muslim population. The riots left 53 people dead, of which at least 2/3 belonged to the minority Muslim community. Eyewitness accounts and videos in circulation show how the local police force joined hands with the rioters against the minority population. It more than evidence that the riots were spurred on by inflammatory speeches made by certain politicians and furthered by messages sent on social media, messaging services, and other forms of other online platforms. However, what we need to do is to look at what happened in the last week of February and into the first week of March in a wider perspective. And this is what I would like to highlight now, that hate speech happens within a particular context. And it's that context that makes it dangerous, or actually maybe sometimes just benign in certain ways. And the first context that we can really speak of is a context of fundamentalism or religious fundamentalism. Of course, we know that religious fundamentalism as a movement sees beliefs as being timeless and universal, and sees the application of these religious commandments as being universal. Interestingly, the term fundamentalist itself emerges from a Christian idea and was first used in the 1920s for certain conservative Protestant groups in the United States of America. On a very personal level, fundamentalism is characterized by a comprehensive and absolutist belief system capable of generating intense aspirations and total commitment to precepts. It involves a totalistic definition of reality in order to revitalize authentic values, usually by restoring the commitment and spirit of a past era. And this is important because also for us as people doing theology, and Peter has been talking about this, how God talk is necessarily hate speech sometimes. I think theological systems which are total and offer a full explanation also then tend to be totalitarian. And this is something that I think we must account for. The second part of this is actually sectarianism, or what specifically in India we call communalism, quite different from the rest of the world. And I will be using these terms communalism and sectarianism interchangeably, particularly for what it means from the Indian context. The world over, the term communalism refers to harmonious living in community. What we refer to as communalism in India would be called sectarianism elsewhere. Communalism or sectarianism would mean the coming together of religious communities in order to achieve a certain secular goal. That is to say, Hindus should unite as Hindus, Christians should unite as Christians, Muslims as Muslims, in order to defend their interests as merchants or farmers in order to get a political power. Communalism as an ideology is based on the assumption that people belonging to a particular faith also must and should have common social, economic, and political interests, and therefore the interests of believers in different religions are not different. Communalism is most of all an ideology. As an ideology, it is popular because it offers an easy explanation of life and prescribes a remedy for the personal tensions and problems of the believer. By doing this, they offer security and certainty in the world and does away with the obligation of thinking. The ideology creates myths about itself and other communities, presenting itself as victims who need to retaliate to win back its lost pride. In the particular instance of India, we find that it is the majority community that presents itself as the victim. And therefore, we find ourselves in the unusual position of having a majority community that has a minority consciousness. And of course, this is not restricted to India. I mean, one can really see itself playing out in the politics of whiteness in America, for example, where the majority white population actually sees itself as being the victim. The third thing is sectarianism, although it may exist as an ideology, it becomes particularly dangerous when it becomes sectarian violence. Communal ideology is not the same as communal violence, as the former can exist for a fairly long period of time without necessarily escalating into communal violence. It is precisely for this reason that we must begin our analysis from communal and fundamentalist ideologies and not from communal violence. There are three stages really of how communal ideology moves to communal violence, but I will skip over that part. And of course, this can lead to what is broadly known as fascism. And unfortunately, we live in a time where, and we're speaking of hate speech here, where there are certain words that have become meaningless. Democracy is one of them, and fascism is another. We have the general idea that fascism is a bad thing, and it's used very widely to speak of anyone we don't agree with. But perhaps astute political analysis is needed at this time to discern whether what is going on in several parts of the world is really a fascism, is it a neo-fascism, or do we need new political language actually to be able to explain this? And then fascism, of course, when it explodes, it becomes genocide, and entire populations have suffered because of this. Now, hate speech occurs at all levels of this flow that I would speak of. So it happens at every single level. And even in religious fundamentalism, often is a fundamental that's directed toward as hate against the other. But what I would like to particularly point out is hate speech becomes violent when it really engages with power. So, for example, a minority community, people who are oppressed may speak bad things about others, but it doesn't have the possibility of turning into violence unless it is coupled with power. And I think we need to account for this dynamic of power within this entire process. Now, in India particularly, what are the causes of this communalism that we have and the hate speech that is part of it? And I'd like to point out that hate speech actually emerges out of and speaks from these various perspectives. So one of the things is actually how history is written. History has become a major player in the politics of communalism. Just as any ideology uses myth and legend to sustain itself, and the class interests that uphold communalism also uses a specific reading and interpretation of history. A communal reading of history by both Hindu and Muslim communalist project in India is an unrelenting struggle within these two religious communities. In reality, the struggle was more socio-economic and socio-political than it was religious. This communal reading of Indian history is a strongly colonial project and was used by the British to facilitate their own political and economic interests. In fact, when analyzed properly, we realize that communalism is itself a very modern ideology that emerges out of communalism. So colonialism. And so the colonial project was to read Indian history as a series of invasions in order to justify the project of colonialism itself. Now, secondly, the socio-economic perspective of colonialism. There can be hardly any doubt that the period of colonialism created a socio-economic crisis in India. In the period of independence, the chosen capitalistic model of economy has not delivered the promised development either. While there were tremendous opportunities made, especially for the middle classes, in the period immediately after independence, in both the government and in the private sectors of the economy, this initial push was exhausted by the mid-1960s. And the middle classes began to see themselves back in a situation of job scarcity and lack of opportunity. It is in this period that we first begin to notice the influence of communal ideology. In the present context, with the onslaught of globalization and the rapid declining of employment opportunities, we find communal ideology at its worst. There can hardly be any doubt that there exists a close connection between communal ideology and globalization. In fact, it almost has to be accepted that communal ideology, fundamentalism, identity politics, and even terrorism has become an inextricable part of the globalized world. It is not mere coincidence that the worst cases of communalism and communal riots up in India are the places which are or have faced the greatest amount of change because of globalization. Bombay, Gujarat, New Delhi, and the list, of course, goes on. Capitalistic development has funneled communalism and communal politics in two ways. On the one hand, it has been unable to solve the problems of unemployment, poverty, etc., and thus prevent frustration and unhealthy competition for scarce jobs. And on the other, prosperity has been generated for a certain class, leading to a visible and sharp inequality. Particularly affected have been the petty bourgeois or the middle classes in India. And this is the group that has been largely affected by communal ideology. So it's no wonder that the present government has its base in a particular community in Gujarat. The political basis, of course, and we know that there is, if we are going to use religion as a way of mass mobilization, this becomes a particularly usable tool in electoral politics. But I would like to highlight a social psychological basis. I mean, in two ways. Firstly, the loss of identity due to the processes of modernization and homogenizing and effects of globalization are one of the major causes of communalism. These processes lead to feelings of humiliation and radically lowered self-worth, and the masses have to bear the effects of bureaucratic and other impersonal accounts, while the elite classes are humiliated by the imagined defeat of their civilization and the impression of being second-class citizens in the global world. I mean, also resonates now with Make America Great Again, right? A feeling of grandiosity and glorification of the past to which one is to return replaces these feelings of humiliation. In India, of course, this golden past was a time when neither Muslims nor Christians were present, and the rigid order of caste and patriarchy were firmly in place. A situation, no doubt, that would be favorable to the present elites, that fear their position being snatched away from forces outside, as well as assertive lower caste groups, as well as religious minorities. But it also is becoming it's also important for us to pay attention to some of the psychosexual politics at work here. And to do this, we have to understand that in India, the Sangh Parivar has an almost unnatural fear of the sexual prowess of the Islamic male and the fertility of the Islamic woman. This is not only manifest in the oft-quoted myth of the enormous increase in the Muslim population in the country, but in overtly sexual violence and language and symbols used by the Hindu right. In an article entitled The Feminization of Violence, the author quotes an interview with a Shiv Sena activist who makes the point that when Hindu households were being burnt in Mumbai reached the ears of his wife, she remarked, "I should offer you bangles now. What are we in our own country? Hindus are being burnt." And of course, wearing bangles is seen to be very effeminate, right? A female, a feminine thing. So his masculinity is being brought into the question. The manhood of the activist is being put into question here. It is as though he has been emasculated. It is also interesting to note that the question, what are we, is posed instead of who are we. The obvious innuendo being made here is that the activist is a eunuch and not a man. The same sexual overtone was once again seen in on the campuses of one of our universities in India, in which right-wing groups chanted, "Jis Hinduo ka khoon na khula, wo Hindu nahi, wo hijra hai." That Hindu whose blood does not boil is not a Hindu, but a trans person. And of course, this kind of penal envy is further perpetuated by the loss of the Indian Hindu cricket team to Muslim Pakistan. And therefore, we find why in the politics of all of this, cricket becomes a very important part. Even worse so, we know that in cases of religious violence in India, cricket bats, parts of cricket equipment are used to hurt the bodies of the minority community women, particularly in very, very graphic and sexual ways. So the question is, what is to be done now? Firstly, I think we need to critique the role of the state. Everyone would agree that what we need is a strong and impartial state. But unfortunately, we know that the state is not neutral. The state acts in the favor of those who are in power. And yet we need to have a state, a police force, armed force that is better trained, sensitive, and would actually assert a law and order in which everyone is equal. But that is really not happening. I mean, Rage Against the Machine says it the best, right? Some of those who work forces are the ones who bear crosses, who burn crosses. Second thing I think we need to do is education for peace. Let us not be naive that an educated population is a non-sectarian population. What is being called into is not more education, but rather an inquiry into what is being taught in our education system. We need to change our interpretation of history to look at things from a more secular perspective, perhaps. And then, of course, we need to interrogate the media. What is needed here is not just truthful reporting, but also an ethical reporting of what is sensitive. And we must be able to engage creatively and critically with new forms of media and social media itself. And I would like to posit that what we also need perhaps is a new ecumenism. And this is the tension that I would flesh out between justice and unity. The ecumenical movement is so vested in the question of unity that sometimes we do it at the cost of justice. And in India, we have particularly been witness to something like this, where a court case ruled quite incorrectly in the favor of the majority Hindu population in the building of a temple over a disputed piece of land, simply to placate the population and to ensure that there was peace. But where is justice in this? And is justice somehow being lost? So how do we move forward theologically? I would like to actually do this by rereading the question of Hagar, considering Hagar. As we know, the story is about these two women, Sarah and Hagar, with Abraham actually the one enjoying but yet perpetrating the violence in the background. And this is a particularly important story for us because it's a story that resonates between three religious communities. The first is the Christian, of course, Jewish, and the Islamic community. And this is a story which brings into question a God who chooses and a God of justice. And of course, the idea of God, and even though she is named, Hagar names God as the one who sees, the question we must ask is, what does God actually see? Who does God actually stand with? And sometimes the God that Hagar sees is actually a brute force that drags her back into a situation of injustice. And therefore, I would like to bring this to the fore, and I know I'm running out of my time, so I will just read you this quotation by Phyllis Tribble. And she says, speaking of Hagar, which can parallel the experiences of minority in this country, she says, Hagar experiences exodus without liberation, revelation without salvation, wilderness without covenant, wandering without land, promise without fulfillment, and unmerited exile without return. The second parable that I would like to talk about is the parable of the prodigal son, and to look at it not from the perspective of the second son who returns, but rather the first son. Putting it into context, this is a story about who is not being counted. And therefore, to ask us to engage our theologies from the perspective of those who are not counted. If we're talking about hate speech and God talk, who talks? It's not just a question of what is being said, but who is doing the talking here. And I think that becomes important in both these stories, to see and learn and listen to those who are actually being excluded. And I would like to close with actually making an ethical conclusion. Perhaps what we need then is not so much a theology as much as an ethic which does not link the ideas of nationalism to the ideologies of the powerful. Not a nationalism that's fed off the texts of the dominant caste communities. Not a nationalism that's directed towards an unfailing loyalty to the state, which is nothing but a committee that oversees the affairs of the wealthy, as Marx puts it. but instead a nation that is directed towards the interests of the most vulnerable, the very least the minority. For in the end, shall we not be asked, what have you done for the least of these, my brothers and sisters? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. Wow, that was a ride through a lot of thoughts. Very, very thick paper that we have received here. So I hope you can digest that. We have invited Susan Derber to respond to that first. So have a prepared response. Susan has been with us yesterday with a paper presenting and actively in the discussion, of course. Let me quickly reintroduce Susan here. She's a minister of the United Reformed Church in the United Kingdom, presently serving a congregation in Taunton in southwest of England. Susan is the moderator of the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches and a dear member and friend here also of this group. Susan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you, Philip. I can't comment on all that you said, it would take too long, but thank you for a bravura presentation. I have no right really to comment on your paper. I have spent but a week or so in my entire life in your country, though as a white British woman, of course, my forebears were in your country for centuries and deliberately exploited, as you say, into religious conflict. So I hardly dare speak. I've recently discovered that one of my great-grandfathers served in the British Army in India. So all I'm going to do is check out that I've understood some of the many, many rich things that you said and offer some reflections that your excellent paper inspired in me. I think any response to your paper has to begin with sorrow and grief in the face of so much suffering, both in recent years and over time. You begin with an account of violence this year and showed us those terrible pictures. But your reflection and analysis could apply to the long years of such violence that have been part of the history of India and Pakistan, including, of course, the colonial period and that time of partition in 1947 when millions of people died. You're surely right to see violence as a symptom, and you identify communal ideology and politics as the real disease that leads to such violence and death. And communalism, a term I hadn't heard before, but which you explain might be termed sectarianism, means, I think you persuaded me, that religious communities come together to achieve secular goals so that the religious names become labels of identity that define communities over against each other, rather than defining religious beliefs or practices. I think from my context, rather as though it might be in Northern Ireland through parts of its history and still today. So you describe what happens when a community seeks to blame someone for their own poverty by scapegoating an other. When a community begins to feel that they have somehow lost status, when their pride is wounded, even a majority community can identify themselves as the victim and so look for the other who has, as they judge, made them victim. And I thought this was a fascinating insight into the way that a majority community can begin to be identified as victim. So whether through internal politics or the impact of globalization, a people or a whole community can feel that their worth has been diminished. And this leads them to reassert their identity, sometimes drawing on a mythical, supposedly glorious past, and to find another victim on which to project their pain, their own rage and humiliation boiling over into violence. I highlight this point because I was struck that I recognize this phenomenon of people losing pride and self-worth. And it can, I think, be found in human communities around the world. I think it would characterize, for example, some working class communities in the former industrial towns of the UK, where right-wing movements have arisen successfully and in which scapegoats are then sought in so-called immigrant communities. What happens, it seems to me, is that people look for someone to blame for their own loss of pride or status, or for their poverty, and they miss actually those who are truly responsible, those really in power. So it's in the interests of those who benefit from the present economic systems that those who do not benefit locate other scapegoats than them. And this happens, I think, the world over. And then the wealthy and secure blame the others for being violent when it's their economic violence that has created the problem. So you suggest some remedies like a strong and impartial state that is secular in the sense of treating all religions equally. Though I would suggest that the same mechanism of those whose pride and dignity has been removed seeking a scapegoat may also happen in a secular state. I think we probably do see that happening in the United States. It's just that the labels of the scapegoats will be different. This happens in the UK, in some places with reference to religion, and in some places not. So Islamophobia is part of what's happening in the UK, and racism in other cases too. I would suggest that we need to find ways in all our countries to avoid the scenario where whole communities suffer any loss of pride and dignity, to avoid this scapegoat mechanism happening. I was struck too, of course, by your comments about ecumenism at the end. And you suggest that we need a new, you say more modern in your paper, kind of ecumenism that is more about a common struggle together for justice than a search for common unity. But I think I would not want to oppose those two forms of ecumenism, or one might frame them as responses to human conflict. Of course, we should, and we can, and we do draw each other into a common commitment to justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. But I think there is a real need for a kind of ecumenism which is about finding ways that we can meet one another so that we can recognize our common dignity, humanity, and worth, and so find that unity between each other for which Christ prayed. I think only in meeting each other, as Anthony suggested, can we overcome the desire and the prevalence of hate speech. And I think I would say that there is hate speech to be overcome through the ecumenical movement too. There is so much in your paper to encourage us to find ways of seeing each other or any other not as victim or chosen or simply other, but as one with us. I think that's at the core of what the ecumenical movement is about. And I think that could be the center of any response to violence between communities. But I offer these thoughts in all humility as someone who has learned a great deal from your paper that was entirely new to me. So thank you, Philip.
Thanks a lot. Philip, if you want to react immediately, then keep it as brief as possible.
Just to say thank you to Susan.
Now that was very brief. Thank you. Thanks, Susan, for this profound response. I think it is very helpful. I mean, to have this discussion about then what is all of this telling us about ecumenism and our ways of shaping ecumenism. All of us are in one way or another, we are involved in positions, commissions to give shape to the ongoing ecumenical movement. If we say that the hate speech is really much based and informed by a growing rise of dichotomies, instead of plurality, instead of multilateralism, there's a constant push towards binary thinking, dualistic thinking, which of course always supports very much then thinking of we against the others, and that I mean that is the whole spiral then unfolds, as Philip has informed us also. Then all kinds of combinations are built into these binary thinkings, and this is in the end leads to violence, even genocide. Ecumenism, on the other hand, is exactly the counter model, overcoming binary thinking and moving into a more pluralistic thinking in terms of there are different ways of going towards the truth and learning from the truth, the one word, and that is that needs to be respected. So this is one thought. Feel free to add your thoughts here if you want. We have some comments also in the chat boxes, also on YouTube, but also here. Peter Crutchley, you want to come in here?
I think in many ways, Fernando, you answered what I was trying to express, really. But I think, are we too confident that ecumenism can settle this problem? That ecumenism has the power to reconcile? What I took particularly from Philip, as you were giving this sort of power reading of for language, that this reminds us how we are archie complicit. And so how are we going to deliver this?
Very
so
good.
For me, it's not, I think we're not claiming to be reconcilers, but then therefore we have to be contesting. And my earlier point was only about as the one white monocultural person expecting everybody to speak English. Welcome to ecumenism as plurality. I confess.
Thank you. Sione.
Thank you, Philip. Appreciate your wisdom. And I really like the slides as well. So that was really good. But my question, I'm with you on this. We need to critique the state. But a similar question to what Peter was raised, how do we do it given, as Professor Matsuda, that Elizabeth introduced me to, explained that the state sets the law which decides what's right and wrong. So the state protects itself. So how do we critique this monster that decides what is right? Look at the US situation. I mean, with the Supreme Court nomination, the state is going to, this current administration is going to decide what is justice. So how do we do that? How do we critique the state, given that it just, yeah. I hope my question makes sense, but that's what I'm wanting to know. How do we do it? Thank you, Philip.
Go ahead, Philip.
Right. I agree with Peter. I mean, this is a hard question, right? And more and more ways that the ecumenical movement grows, it becomes more and more actually like the state in a way, and this makes it difficult. So I that's why I call, I mean, and I hope for a new or a modern ecumenism, one in which justice is the imperative and unity, of course, but not at the cost of justice, so to speak. On the one hand, but going more to Sione's question, I think Sione is a little more than that also, isn't it? The state doesn't only decide what is right and wrong, state decides what is. Can we conceive of an existence outside the state in modernity particularly? This is a very hard question, and this is why I think that I take a more, I mean, this is going to be bad language now, but I take a more anarchist position here, because I believe that all authority must continuously legitimize itself. And it should always be in a position to legitimize every action that it does. And not legitimize is a bad word, but to be accountable for this. Every authority must be continually accountable. So I think this is the only way that we could put safer measures in place to make sure that the state doesn't overstep its bounds.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. But it's also, I hear Sioni's question also, and Peter's as a reminder that who are we to speak? So the self-criticism and the self-reflection on how do we shape the ecumenical movement, I mean, comes back to us as a question as well. That needs to be tackled, and especially what Philip, what you are saying, I think that is really a phenomenon that at least in Western Europe is on the march here, and that is, you know, that the majority defines, the dominating majority, white, defines itself as a victim. And that is a new phenomenon that has all to do with whiteness and white supremacy. So and it goes like that we have to now defend, because of all the migrants and immigrants that we have, and all these people who don't understand liberalism and tolerance and all our values. We have to now defend these values, and therefore we become intolerant towards the immigrants. We become we have to protect ourselves and so on. So this phenomenon is really, and then you hammer that into the law system, and there you go. Then you have secured the white supremacy one more time, and it's based on legal rights. It's based on values. It's based on, so that mechanism is really supporting that polarization again. Guys, our time is up. I have to stop talking. I have to finish this session. This is part of my my job as a moderator. I'm so sorry. I have the feeling we need another whole week to discuss these issues, and it will continue, of course. This is we see this as a very fruitful moment in this debate that we are starting more than we are actually ending, hopefully informing our churches about these topics. It's been great to listen to you. In a minute, I will give the word and the floor to Professor Isabel Firi. For me, I will only say thank you to Isabel for calling this meeting together. And thank you for this brilliant team that is working in Geneva to make this all possible. And Nan Braunschweiger, Jin Yang Kim, Sepharosa Carroll, Marcelo Schneider, Albin Hillard, Walter Muniz. These are just some names, and all these people you have not seen here, but without them, we would not have been able to meet. Thanks a lot. Isabel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fernando. It's been a long week, right? And for us, it's not just this 1 week, but you know, the planning that went behind, as Fernando has mentioned. And I want to thank each and every one of you for working with us to make this a success. Without your cooperation, it would not have happened in the way it has. So I want to thank all of you who have presented papers. I want to thank you for the respondents. I want to thank all those who have journeyed with us on through Streamline, and they have participated in the meetings. The idea was, you know, to have this theological conversation and work on the papers a little bit more, publish them so that we share this knowledge and this inspiration with more people. So we are hoping that, you know, you will have that time, you know, to work on the papers. And I want to thank, you know, Fernando in particular for moderating so generously and graciously throughout. You have been an inspiration to the presenters and the audience as well. And so we are grateful to you for the work you've done. And I want to thank all the members of the Theological Study Group of the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace for, putting time aside, to be part of the audience, and even if you were not presenting a paper. So we are grateful to you. And I'm going to close with a word of prayer. So let us pray. Eternal God, we acknowledge that each day is a precious gift from you. You have been with us throughout the 5 webinars we've had this week. You have given us the strength we needed to sustain conversations on hate speech and whiteness in our history as it manifests, and also as it manifests itself today. You have helped us to be silent and to hear each other as we also hear from you. Thank you for stirring in us a spirit of unrestlessness as we face our own compliance with racism. Life-giving God, as we close, we pause to remember the many places where situations where people are being victimized and killed as a result of racism. We lament for those who are being harassed, victimized, and killed because of religious and ethnic conflicts, because of police brutality, because they are minorities in their societies, because they are refugees or stateless, because of their vulnerabilities, because of racism and xenophobia. We ask for mercy, justice, forgiveness, reconciliation, repentance, and restoration, together with reparation, to be evident in these situations and places. Give boldness to those who choose not to remain silent. Give strength to your people, even as we grow weary in crying out to you, how long, God? Give us hope to keep believing and to keep trusting, even as we pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.